The first thing you notice is the shape. Not a statue, not a tool meant for daily use, but a sealed object too carefully made to be discarded, too intentionally finished to be accidental. The second thing you notice is the problem. The find is not in a place where it should exist, and not in a layer that matches its apparent age. Picture an excavation under a sun-baked desert plain, where centuries of wind have turned the soil into an archive nobody asked for. Workers brush away grit, and a small chamber opens like a hidden mouth. Inside, wrapped in layers that still look deliberate, lies a smooth, metal-like casing engraved with repeating marks. They are not decorative. They are ordered, and they look, even to untrained eyes, like a system, something meant to store information, or at least to be read. The paradox begins right there with context. Archaeology can be annoyingly precise when the ground cooperates. Stratigraphy, radiocarbon dating. Sealed tomb conditions, these are the usual guardrails that keep a story honest. But the official reports from that excavation admit something unusual. The casing appears far older than the materials around it, and far more complex than the technology expected for that level of time. The record language is careful, almost reluctant. It doesn't say impossible. It implies uncertainty, like a door held shut with one finger. Within weeks, photographs circulate. The object is smaller than a lunchbox, but its surface is precise enough to feel modern. Some researchers argue it's a later intrusion brought in from elsewhere and buried when the desert shifted. Others insist the burial was sealed long before any disturbance could have reached it. The problem is that both explanations require you to believe in something convenient, and history rarely gives us that luxury. The engraved marks add a second layer of contradiction. When scholars compare the pattern to known scripts from neighboring cultures, the similarities are superficial enough to tempt classification, not enough to confirm it. Attempts to read it as a cipher split the community immediately. One camp says it's symbolic, a ceremonial tag. Another says the repetition and spacing suggest a functional code. Either way, the object refuses to settle into a neat category. Then comes the most unsettling part, the documentation trail. The initial excavation logs are specific about location, packaging, and condition. But when you reach the later pages where materials analysis should explain the origin, the record thins out. Samples were processed, results were requested, and then the thread disappears into institutional silence. The object isn't just mysterious. It becomes inconvenient, like evidence that makes you ask who benefits from the lack of clarity. So the central question doesn't begin with what the artifact is. It begins with what it shouldn't be able to do. A mystery that should have been impossible only makes sense if the normal timeline failed. Somewhere either in the ground, in the records, or in the assumptions we built around what ancient people could or could not produce. In the next chapter, we'll look at what researchers found when they tried to prove the official story and what happened. When the measurements stopped cooperating piece by piece, the official story ends in a place historians rarely admit is fragile, the paperwork. In the documentary record, the artifact is treated like a solved case, described, cataloged, and even given a confident label for its likely origin. But when you follow the trail forward, the certainty doesn't grow. It shrinks. The later materials analysis that should close every loop arrives in fragments, as if someone started to write an answer and then changed their mind halfway through point 1. The excavation logs from the early phase read like a checklist meant to survive scrutiny. Exact find spots, clear photos, careful notes on packaging and condition. There's even a chain of custody tone to it, the kind that says this will matter later. But the deeper you go into the institutional report set, the more the language changes. Processed replaces measured. Requested replaces received. The same sections that should cite instrument readings begin to sound procedural, like paperwork describing that paperwork exists somewhere else. And then there's the contradiction that's hard to dismiss as simple clerical error. The object assigned characteristics stop matching later descriptions. One record implies a surface treatment consistent with a particular workshop style. Yet later text describes where patterns that would only occur under different handling conditions. The measurements aren't wrong in a way you can easily blame on technique. They're wrong in a way that suggests the object being discussed may not be the same object anymore, or that crucial details were averaged out to fit the narrative. The most chilling part is that the early evidence was, on its own, promising. The initial publication didn't just claim an interpretation, it offered physical clues that could be rechecked. Residue impressions along edges. Micro scratches aligned with a repeated motion. An unusual consistency in spacing across marks. Even if you disagreed with the conclusion, you could still see why someone would want to read the artifact one way rather than another. But later research faced an obstacle that doesn't behave like accident. When scholars asked for the raw datasets, spectra files, high-resolution scans, even the dated storage records that would show what was done, and when the response was delays, missing transfers, and a recurring phrase that the results were integrated into internal summaries. The record never gives the numbers. It gives the implication that the numbers existed. It's the difference between a photograph and the memory of one. So what do researchers do when the archive goes quiet? They go back to what was never fully erased. Independent teams obtain copies of the earliest images, remeasure what can still be extracted, and compare the artifact to other regional materials using methods that weren't available when the official report was drafted. That early evidence becomes a lever, not to prove the first narrative correct, but to test whether the artifact behaves like the story says it should. 5, and that's where the challenge begins, quietly at first. In the reproduced imagery, the spacing that was once used to support a single interpretive framework looks different under modern scaling corrections. The marks don't merely repeat. They shift in a way consistent with physical constraints, engraving depth, tool angle, or material hardness varying across production steps. The official account frames these irregularities as artistic variation. The reanalysis treats them as process evidence. Then comes the most destabilizing observation. The artifact's supposed origin is supported mainly by typology arguments from the earliest publication. Yet the later isotopic and compositional explanations never make it into the public record in a verifiable form. Typology is suggestive, but it's not decisive. When the hard chemistry stays behind a curtain, the story becomes self-sealing. Its claims depend on the same authority that refused to show the underlying test. The documentary trail thins out right when it should thicken, leaving a strange vacuum where proof should be. And in that vacuum, the early clues don't just remain unanswered. They start to look like they were waiting for different questions. In the next part, we'll examine the first wave of independent measurements and the timing of when they were blocked because the unanswered question isn't only what the artifact means. It's who needed it to stay unmeasurable. 1. 2. The breakthrough, in cases like this, rarely comes from one grand revelation. It comes from a method that refuses to be impressed by labels and instead checks whether the physical details behave like real evidence. The first independent effort didn't start with high-tech claims. It started with a simple question. Do the artifact's markings obey the same constraints the maker would have faced every day? The reanalysis team treated the surface the way an engineer would treat a fingerprint. They compared the spacing between the marks, not just as an overall pattern, but as something that should correlate with tool limits. If the same hand or workshop produced the engraving, then even when the marks vary, the variation should look coherent in a technical sense. In other words, the irregularities shouldn't be random. They should show that the person carving was working within friction, depth limits, and angle changes. 1. 5. That's the logic. Repeatability with constraints beats visual similarity every time. What made the investigation feel different from the usual typology debate was the decision to quantify what had previously been treated as interpretation. They calibrated for modern imaging distortions, then measured how the marks shift relative to one another across the artifact's surface. Crucially, they didn't assume the official reproduction method was close enough. They tested whether a change in scaling could turn genuine physical variation into an illusion. When the corrected spacing still behaved like a real manufacturing signature, the artistic variation explanation stopped being comfortable. It started being testable. The second piece was timing and procedure, because documentation, not just artifacts, is part of the physical record. The team traced when measurements were requested, when samples were prepared, and when results were said to exist. And they found a familiar anomaly. The narrative became specific about conclusions long before it became specific about process. Point 1. 3. The official archive reference tests. But the publicly verifiable traces raw readings, preserved sample identifiers. Measurement conditions were either missing or locked behind permissions that were never clearly justified. Here's the problem that matters. A chemical or isotopic claim can be compelling, but only if the chain of custody and the measurement protocol are observable. If the record ends right where the hard numbers should appear, then typology becomes the substitute currency. And typology, even when skilled, is a softer tool. It can suggest, but it cannot alone prove origin when the artifact's manufacturing behavior points elsewhere. Then came the simplest but most persistent logic test, cross-compatibility. The investigators asked whether the artifact's physical production constraints could be consistent with the proposed materials and claim sourcing. They didn't demand that every detail match perfectly. They looked for conflicts. If a purported origin would require a different tool hardness, different wear patterns, or an incompatible sequence of surface treatments, those contradictions should show up. They did. The artifact's surface behavior under microscopic and imaging analysis wasn't just different. It aligned with a process that suggests a different production pathway than the one implied by the earliest publication. Point 1. 0. At this point, the mystery shifted. It stopped being only what is it, and became why was it presented in a way that made the decisive checks hard to reproduce. That's where the debate stays alive, because multiple interpretations still fit partial facts. But the strongest explanation begins to look less like a scholarly disagreement and more like an information bottleneck, one maintained long enough for a storyline to settle before the measurements could fully enter public view. The official account frames the missing verifiability as ordinary limitation, sample fragility, archival gaps, legal constraints. Yet the pattern is oddly consistent with claims that would be strengthened by transparency and weakened by delay. The clues don't simply fail to converge. They converge away from what should have been measurable first. And that's the tension we'll keep pulling on. Not just the science of the artifact, but the human choices around it, because the investigation's breakthrough methods don't only solve a puzzle. They also expose how easily a puzzle can be managed. Point 1. 8. In the next part, we'll follow the earliest independent measurements and the moments where access appears to have been quietly obstructed, and what that suggests about who benefited from the unanswered question. What counts as a solution in ancient mysteries? We usually assume it means the same thing the word means in modern life: a decisive match, a repeatable test, and an answer that survives contact with independent replication. But in the story we've been tracing, the decisive moment didn't feel like the end of inquiry. It felt like the end of certain kinds of inquiry. There's a difference between being solved and being rewritten. Some investigators genuinely improved the picture by using better methods, tighter controls, and new comparisons. When a claim can be tested again and again, the uncertainty drops in a way you can measure. Yet here, the uncertainty didn't just shrink. It shifted shape. The official timeline begins to rely less on what is observed and more on what is assumed, assumptions that became convenient precisely when the hardest checks were least reproducible. Point 1. To think about what happens when data access becomes uneven. If early measurements exist, but the specimen's documentation, or full procedures can't be independently examined at the moment a public conclusion is announced. Then certainty can be engineered without anyone ever openly lying. You don't need a conspiracy meeting. You need an information pathway where some people get to test, others get summaries. And the interval for independent verification quietly stretches 0.1. This is why the debate keeps returning to process. The artifact might be one thing, or multiple things, or even a composite over time. The science itself can remain honest while the narrative around it becomes curated. When a story says, "We can't fully confirm because of ordinary limitations," that may be true. But the pattern matters. Limits should appear random. Here, the missing verifiability clusters where it is most valuable for locking in a particular interpretation. 0.1. So what was actually solved? We can say this. The most basic inconsistency was acknowledged, and the newer analysis showed that the earliest framing didn't hold up as firmly as it was presented. That's real progress. It means some earlier claims were overstated, and at least part of the mystery was reduced by better reasoning. That part is genuinely investigative. But what about the bigger certainty, the one that sounds like closure? That's where the line blurs. If the conclusion depends on a narrow slice of evidence, and the procedures that would strengthen or challenge it are hard to reproduce, then the result is less a solved equation and more a stabilized interpretation. In other words, the mystery isn't necessarily erased, it's managed. 0.1. History has many ways to manufacture conviction, not through theatrics, but through timing, access, and the authority of print. Once a narrative is established, later researchers inherit it like weather, even when new measurements disagree. The story can survive by being reinterpreted, softened, or reframed until it fits the next set of facts. That's not unique to one artifact. It's a structural habit of how knowledge spreads. The version that travels farther becomes the version people treat as the default. And that brings us to the unsettling question. When an ancient mystery is solved quickly, do we mean the truth has been found, or just that the debate has been moved into a channel where most viewers never get to see the critical checks? Certainty feels satisfying because it's clean, but cleanliness can be a byproduct of filtration. So maybe the most responsible takeaway isn't a single answer. It's skepticism about how answers arrive. Because even when evidence improves, history can still be rewritten around what we can verify, not just around what is true. 0.1. And if that's the case, then the final mystery isn't only the artifact. It's the machinery of confidence that tells us when the story is over. 0.1. 6.